Please go.
If you ever find someone who makes you apologize for taking up space, don't let them decide how much you deserve to be loved. I didn't understand those words until the night a city burned around us, and the most feared man I'd ever met walked straight through the flames without hesitating for a single heartbeat. Smoke swallowed the hallway so completely that I couldn't tell where the walls ended and the darkness began. Every breath scraped my throat like sandpaper. The emergency lights blinked weakly through the haze, painting everything in flashes of angry red. Somewhere behind me, glass shattered. Somewhere ahead, someone called for help. My knees hit the floor before I realized I had fallen. My lungs refused to cooperate. My legs felt heavier than concrete. The ceiling groaned above us, sending tiny pieces of dust drifting into the orange glow. I looked up at Damien Moretti as he reached for me through the smoke. His white dress shirt was streaked with ash beneath his dark coat, his green eyes steady even while the world seemed to collapse around us. He wasn't supposed to be here. Men like him sent other people into danger. They didn't walk into it themselves. Go, I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. Please, just go. He ignored me. He always ignored the lies I told about myself. He crouched beside me, one knee touching the scorched floor. Heat rolled across the hallway in heavy waves. Every instinct told me to push him away before I ruined his chance to escape. Tears blurred my vision. I'm too heavy, I cried, shaking my head. You'll never make it if you carry me. His expression never changed. Not fear, not frustration, not even pity, only certainty, the kind that made impossible things sound ordinary. He slipped one arm behind my shoulders and the other beneath my knees as if I weighed nothing at all. Emily, he said softly, close enough for me to hear despite the alarms echoing through the building. You're perfect. The words struck harder than the heat surrounding us. My entire life had been measured in apologies. Sorry I ate too much. Sorry I took up too much room. Sorry I wasn't prettier. Sorry I wasn't smaller. Sorry I existed in a body that never seemed good enough for anyone, especially me. Yet somehow the only man everyone else feared looked at me like I had never needed to apologize for a single day of my life. He stood with me in his arms, turned toward the wall of smoke ahead, and without another word, carried me into the fire. 48 hours earlier, I still believed he was just another stranger passing through my ordinary life. 48 hours earlier, the hardest part of my day had nothing to do with smoke or fire. It was squeezing into the employee break room chair and pretending not to notice when someone quietly pulled another chair farther away to make more space. Nobody meant to be cruel. At least that was what I kept telling myself. People rarely noticed the tiny things they did. The extra glance, the awkward smile, the casual suggestion that the salad place across the street was probably a healthier choice. I smiled through all of it because smiling was easier than explaining that I had spent my entire life trying to become smaller for people who would always find something else to criticize. County Memorial Hospital woke before the sun did. By 6:30 in the morning, monitors were already chiming, coffee was already cold, and the emergency department felt like it had skipped sleep altogether. I tightened my ponytail, adjusted my navy scrubs, clipped my identification badge onto my pocket, and reminded myself that patients deserved the best version of me, even when I did not believe I deserved much myself. Children made that easier. They never cared about the number on a scale. They cared about warm hands, calm voices, and someone who stayed beside them when everything felt frightening. That morning, I spent nearly an hour reading dinosaur stories to a little boy with a broken arm because his mother was stuck in traffic. When she finally arrived with tears in her eyes, she hugged me so tightly I almost forgot every unkind thought I had carried into work. Almost. During lunch, I skipped the cafeteria and walked outside instead. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh rain. I sat alone on a wooden bench, unwrapped the turkey sandwich I had packed, and watched strangers hurry down the sidewalk with places to be. My phone buzzed. It was another message from my older sister reminding me that confidence started with the way I talked to myself. I typed back the same answer I always gave. I am trying. Before I could press send, a little girl wearing a bright yellow backpack sprinted across the hospital entrance chasing a red balloon that had slipped from her fingers. She laughed as it floated toward the busy street, completely unaware of the black luxury sedan approaching the curb. My heart lurched. I dropped my lunch onto the bench and ran without thinking, never imagining that the next 30 seconds would quietly change the course of both our lives forever. The little girl's sneakers slipped on the wet pavement as the red balloon danced higher with every gust of wind. She smiled at the sky instead of the traffic, completely trusting that the world would somehow wait for her. I reached her a second before she stepped off the curb, wrapping both arms around her and pulling her gently back onto the sidewalk. The black sedan came to a smooth stop only a few feet away, its engine barely making a sound. The driver never leaned on the horn. He simply waited. I knelt beside the little girl, brushing a strand of blonde hair away from her frightened face. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to steady my own breathing. She nodded, then burst into tears as children often did after the danger had already passed. A woman rushed out from the hospital entrance, panic written across her face. "Olivia," she cried, wrapping the little girl in a tight embrace before turning toward me with grateful eyes. "Thank you." I looked away for 1 second. I smiled. She is safe. That is all that matters. Behind us, the rear passenger door of the sedan opened. A man stepped onto the sidewalk with the kind of quiet confidence that made every nearby conversation fade without anyone realizing it. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it looked effortless. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and the autumn breeze barely disturbed it. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. Calm, watchful, the sort of eyes that noticed everything while revealing almost nothing. He looked first at the little girl, then at me. "You moved before anyone else did," he said in a deep, measured voice. Most people froze. I shrugged, suddenly aware that my hospital badge was hanging crooked after running across the entrance. She needed someone. His gaze lingered for another second, not uncomfortable, simply thoughtful, as though he were memorizing a page from a book. "What is your name?" he asked. "Emily Carter." He nodded once. "Thank you, Miss Carter." Before I could ask who he was, another man in a dark suit approached him and quietly spoke a few words. I could not hear them, but the respect in his voice was unmistakable. The stranger gave a small nod, stepped back into the sedan, and the long black car disappeared into midtown traffic as silently as it had arrived. I stood there watching until it vanished around the corner, wondering why someone I had never met felt strangely familiar. I told myself it was only another unusual moment in a busy hospital day. I had no way of knowing that the man in the black sedan had already asked someone to learn everything they could about the nurse who never hesitated to save a child she did not even know. The rest of my shift should have been ordinary, but something invisible had shifted the moment that black sedan disappeared from the hospital entrance. I could not explain it. I only knew I caught myself glancing through the emergency room windows every time another luxury car pulled into the circular driveway. None of them belonged to the stranger with the calm green eyes. By 7 that evening my feet ached. My coffee had gone cold for the 3rd time, and I was helping a frightened 8-year-old practice slow breathing before a routine procedure. He squeezed my hand so tightly that my fingers tingled. "Will it hurt?" he whispered. "Only for a moment," I answered with the most reassuring smile I could manage. Sometimes the scariest part is waiting. After that, you discover you are much braver than you thought. He nodded with surprising determination. Moments like that reminded me why I had chosen nursing. I could not fix every problem, but I could make someone feel less alone while facing it. My shift finally ended just after 8. Outside, a light rain painted the sidewalks silver beneath the streetlights. I pulled my jacket tighter and started the 6-block walk toward the subway station. Halfway there, I noticed the neighborhood bakery was still open. The owner, Mrs. Bennett, always packed the leftover bread into paper bags before closing and quietly handed them to anyone who looked hungry. I stopped to help her carry 2 boxes inside before leaving with a warm cinnamon roll she insisted I take for free. "You always help everyone else," she said with a gentle smile. "Tonight, let somebody be kind to you." I thanked her, feeling embarrassed by such a simple gesture. Across the street, unnoticed by me, another black vehicle remained parked beneath the shadow of an old maple tree. Damien Moretti sat in the back seat, watching through rain-covered glass without saying a word. "Everything matches the report," his driver said quietly. "Emily Carter, 27, pediatric nurse, lives alone, volunteers twice a month. No debt beyond student loans. No record of trouble." Damien continued looking toward the bakery, where I laughed softly at something Mrs. Bennett had said. "Interesting," he murmured. Most people become careful when they think someone important is watching. She behaves exactly the same when she believes nobody sees her. The driver waited for another instruction. After several seconds, Damien spoke again. Do not interfere with her life. He paused, his eyes never leaving the sidewalk where I had begun walking home beneath a borrowed umbrella. Just make certain she arrives home safely. I never noticed the respectful distance between us that rainy evening. I only remember thinking the city somehow felt a little less lonely than it had the day before. The next 2 days settled into a rhythm that felt comfortably ordinary, yet tiny coincidences kept finding me wherever I went. The vending machine that usually swallowed my dollars suddenly worked perfectly. The broken elevator in my apartment building was repaired overnight after sitting out of service for nearly 3 weeks. When I reached the bus stop one rainy morning without an umbrella, an elderly woman smiled and insisted on sharing hers all the way to the hospital. I thanked fate for the unexpected kindness, never imagining someone else was quietly arranging for life to become a little gentler whenever possible. At County Memorial, October arrived with crowded hallways and exhausted smiles. Every room seemed full. Every monitor seemed to chime at once. I spent most of my shift comforting frightened families, changing bandages, delivering warm blankets, and reminding anxious parents that children often healed faster than adults expected. By the end of the afternoon, my feet throbbed, but seeing a little girl finally laugh after hours of tears somehow made every aching muscle worthwhile. During my dinner break, I stepped outside with a cup of soup balanced carefully in my hands. The cool breeze carried the scent of rain mixed with roasted chestnuts from a street vendor across the avenue. For a few peaceful minutes, the city slowed down. Then a familiar black sedan rolled quietly to the curb across the street. I recognized it immediately, although I told myself there were probably hundreds just like it in Manhattan. The rear window lowered only a few inches before stopping. I caught a brief glimpse of calm green eyes looking toward the hospital entrance, not searching for attention, simply observing. Before I could decide whether to wave, the traffic light turned green and the car disappeared into the evening rush. I smiled to myself, slightly embarrassed that I had even considered the possibility that he remembered me. On the opposite side of the tinted glass, Damien rested one hand against the leather armrest without speaking. His longtime advisor glanced toward the hospital entrance before looking back at him. You could introduce yourself properly, he suggested. Damien shook his head once. Not yet. You have already helped her more than she realizes. Damien watched as I laughed with 2 young patients waving through the lobby window. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Kindness loses its meaning the moment it expects recognition, he answered quietly. Let her keep believing the world still surprises people for no reason. I finished my soup, adjusted my backpack, and walked back inside believing I had simply crossed paths with an unforgettable stranger for the second time. I had no idea that every quiet act of generosity surrounding me was becoming part of a promise I had never heard anyone make. By Friday evening, I finally learned the stranger's name without anyone meaning to tell me. I was finishing paperwork at the pediatric station when 2 surgeons walked past discussing a charity gala scheduled for the following week. One of them laughed quietly and said, "If Damien Moretti donates again this year, the children's wing might finally get that expansion." The other nodded as though the name required no explanation. I looked up for only a second before returning to my charts. Wealthy people funded hospitals all the time. I told myself he was simply another businessman with more money than he knew what to do with. Still, the name lingered in my thoughts longer than it should have. Near the end of my shift, a young patient named Noah refused to speak after a frightening asthma attack. His mother looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from hours of worry. I sat beside his bed with a box of crayons and began drawing clumsy cartoon dinosaurs. After several minutes, Noah smiled, despite himself, and quietly corrected the shape of one tail with a green crayon. "That one is a stegosaurus," he whispered. His mother covered her mouth to hide happy tears. Watching him find his voice again reminded me that healing rarely happened all at once. Sometimes it arrived one tiny moment at a time. When I finally left the hospital, the air had turned crisp, carrying the first real hint of autumn. I stopped at a neighborhood grocery store to pick up milk and soup before walking toward my apartment. The cashier frowned when she scanned my loyalty card. "That is strange," she said. "Your groceries have already been paid for." I blinked in confusion. "By who?" She looked toward the front windows, but whoever had been there was already gone. A gentleman said you once helped someone important to him. That is all he would tell me. I laughed awkwardly and insisted on paying anyway. Kindness should never become a debt. The cashier smiled, canceled the previous transaction, and handed me my receipt. Across the street, Damien watched through the rain-speckled window of his parked sedan before quietly setting his own receipt aside. His advisor glanced at him with a patient smile. You knew she would refuse. Damien looked toward the grocery store entrance just as I stepped outside, carrying my single paper bag. Yes, he answered softly. That was never the point. I walked home beneath a sky filled with fading gold, completely unaware that the distance between our worlds was shrinking with every quiet choice either of us made. Saturday arrived with rare blue skies and a welcome day off. I spent the morning volunteering at the neighborhood community center where children painted pumpkins, laughed over crooked paper ghosts, and proudly showed me masterpieces that looked nothing like the pictures they were supposed to become. I love that about children. They never apologized for creating something imperfect. Somewhere along the way, adults forgot how to be that fearless. Just after noon, Mrs. Bennett from the bakery called asking whether I could stop by for a few minutes because one of her employees had gone home sick. I gladly agreed. The shop smelled of cinnamon, warm bread, and fresh coffee, the kind of comforting scents that made strangers smile before they even reached the counter. Business stayed steady until a black sport utility vehicle quietly pulled into the parking space outside. My heartbeat stumbled for reasons I could not explain. Damien Moretti stepped inside wearing a dark wool coat instead of a tailored suit. Without the polished boardroom appearance, he somehow looked even more composed. He ordered a simple black coffee and one loaf of sourdough bread. When Mrs. Bennett disappeared into the kitchen to answer the phone, I found myself standing across the counter from him in unexpected silence. We keep meeting, I finally said with an awkward smile. A hint of warmth reached his eyes. Perhaps New York is smaller than people think. I laughed softly while placing the bread into a paper bag. That would explain a lot. He accepted the bag, but did not immediately leave. Instead, his attention drifted toward a little boy struggling to push open the bakery door while balancing two grocery bags almost as large as he was. Damien crossed the room without hesitation, opened the door, and carried one bag inside before kneeling to speak with the child at eye level. Whatever he said made the boy grin from ear to ear. It lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it quietly dismantled every assumption I had made about powerful men. When he returned to the counter, I handed him his coffee. Thank you, I said before I could stop myself. He looked genuinely puzzled. For what? For noticing people. For the first time since we had met, the carefully guarded distance in his expression softened completely. Everyone wants to be seen, Emily. Most people are simply too distracted to look. The bell above the bakery door chimed as he stepped back onto the sidewalk. I watched through the front window until he disappeared into the afternoon crowd, unaware that only 3 blocks away, a forgotten electrical problem had already begun filling an old apartment building with smoke, setting invisible events into motion that would bring both of our worlds crashing together before another sunset. The smell reached us before the alarms did. Sharp, bitter, thick enough to erase the comforting scent of fresh bread that had filled the bakery only moments earlier. Mrs. Bennett looked toward the front window with a worried expression. Outside, people had stopped walking. Instead, they were pointing toward the brick apartment building at the end of the block, where gray smoke curled into the afternoon sky. Someone shouted that families were still inside. Before I could think, I had already untied my apron. Every lesson I had learned as a nurse overpowered every instinct telling me to stay back. Emily, Mrs. Bennett called after me, but I was already running. Sirens echoed through the streets as neighbors gathered behind the safety barriers. Firefighters were organizing equipment while anxious voices filled the cool autumn air. A woman stood near the entrance crying that her 6-year-old daughter had hidden somewhere inside after becoming frightened. Nobody knew exactly where. My heart tightened. I recognized that sound in the mother's voice. It was the sound of hope slipping away 1 second at a time. Without stopping to question myself, I wrapped a damp jacket around my mouth and followed one of the firefighters through the lobby before the smoke became too heavy to see clearly. Every hallway looked the same beneath the flashing emergency lights. Sweetheart, I called gently. My name is Emily. I am here to help you. At first there was only silence. Then somewhere down the corridor, I heard the faintest sob. I followed the sound into a small apartment where a little girl crouched beneath a kitchen table, clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her tiny shoulders shook with fear. I knelt beside her and smiled as calmly as I could. "Your mom is waiting outside." She looked up with wide, frightened eyes. "I cannot find the door," she whispered. "That is okay," I answered. "You found me instead." I lifted her carefully into my arms and started back toward the hallway. The smoke had grown thicker. Heat pressed against the walls. Visibility shrank with every step. We reached the stairwell only to discover debris blocking the lower landing. My pulse raced, but I forced my voice to remain steady for the little girl resting against my shoulder. "Everything is going to be all right." I hoped she believed me because I was trying very hard to believe it myself. Then, through the haze, I heard familiar footsteps moving toward us with calm, deliberate purpose. Even before I saw his face, something deep inside me knew exactly who had come back for us. Damien emerged through the smoke with the same impossible calm I remembered from the hospital entrance, as though panic had never learned how to exist in his presence. His green eyes found mine first, then the little girl clinging to my shoulder. "You found her," he said quietly. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "The stairwell is blocked." He glanced toward the hallway, measured the distance with one careful look, and stepped closer. "Give her to me." The little girl reached for him without hesitation, and he settled her securely against one arm before turning back toward me. That was when the weakness I had been ignoring finally caught up with me. My knees trembled. Every breath felt heavier than the one before it. I looked at the narrow path ahead, then at Damien, and all the old doubts I had carried for years came rushing back at once. Tears blurred my vision. "I cannot," I whispered. "I am too heavy." The words escaped before I could stop them. They were not really about that moment. They belonged to every cruel joke I had ever laughed along with, every dressing room mirror I had avoided, every apology I had offered simply for existing. Damien stared at me as though I had spoken a language he refused to accept. He carefully settled the little girl onto his back, wrapping her tiny arms safely around his shoulders. Then he stepped in front of me and gently took both of my shaking hands. "Emily," he said, his voice steady enough to quiet every fear inside me. "You are not carrying too much weight. You have been carrying too many unkind words." I could not answer. He smiled, warm enough to cut through the smoke surrounding us. "You are perfect." Before another doubt could leave my lips, he lifted me with effortless certainty, making me feel protected instead of ashamed. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like a burden. I felt worth saving. Step by careful step, he carried both hope and courage through the fading haze until fresh autumn air finally greeted us outside. The little girl ran into her mother's waiting embrace while cheers rose from the gathered crowd, but I barely heard them. I could only see Damien helping me gently back onto my feet. 1 year later, the Children's Wellness Center opened its new confidence program for young people struggling with self-worth, funded anonymously by a donor who never allowed his name on the building. Every week, I watched children learn to stand a little taller, smile a little brighter, and believe kinder things about themselves. Damien still visited often, always carrying fresh bread from Mrs. Bennett's bakery. Whenever I caught him looking at me with that quiet smile, I finally understood the greatest rescue of my life had never been from the smoke. It had been from the years I spent believing I had to become smaller before I deserved to be loved.